Welcome to Books in the World, the longest-running author interview show in the United States, 42 glorious years. I'm Mick Carlin. Today's guest is author, historian, and professor Ray Anthony Shepard. Mr. Shepard is the author of Now or Never, an illuminating look into the 54th Massachusetts Infantry's war to end slavery, and Runaway, the daring escape of Ona Judge, an inspiring book that certainly opened my eyes. Mr. Shepard was the first African-American editor-in-chief of a major educational publishing house, Houghton, Mifflin, as well as a teacher at Phillips Andover Academy and a professor at Brandeis University. A warm welcome to Mr. Ray Anthony Shepard.
Thank you, Mick. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that introduction.
You're very welcome, sir. Ray, you were born in Missouri and grew up on the prairies of Nebraska. How would you describe your childhood?
Well, I was born in Sedalia, Missouri, and both of my parents were from the area. They were raised in the time of Jim Crow. In fact, my grandfather, my mother's father, was enslaved in Marshall, Missouri. He was born in 1859 and emancipated by the Missouri State Ordinance of Emancipation in 1865, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Mm-hmm. My father moved to Lincoln, Nebraska to work on the railroad. He was a chef cook during World War II, moving troops from Chicago to San Francisco or California for the war in Asia. I grew up in, as I said, Lincoln, Nebraska. Mm-hmm. Went to a laboratory school at the University of Nebraska at age 4. Mm. And so I, in many ways, born where the Missouri, a place of the Missouri Compromise, and grew up in the Kansas-Nebraska political era. Mm-hmm. So,
when did you move to Nebraska?
I was very young by the time we moved to Nebraska, but history was very much part of the state.
Yeah.
Yes.
Were books a big part of your childhood?
Well, yes and no. I was not necessarily a great student. There were books in the house, but neither of my parents read a lot. My mother bought books, had them in the house. Mm-hmm. They were part of her aspirations for the children. Mm-hmm. My father was not a big believer in education, particularly higher education, because he thought it was of little benefit to blacks at that time. And so he thought it was a waste of time. Oh. But my mother, on the other hand, always believed in education and pushed us, even though she herself did not read a lot.
Yeah. When did the writing bug first bite you?
Well, actually from a young age, when before going into high school, as I said, even though I wasn't a good student, I sewed newspapers on the corner, and it so happened I sewed newspapers in front of a typewriter store.
Oh, geez.
And so I got to know the owner, and he let me buy a typewriter for $1 a week.
Whoa.
And I would sit on my front porch, and in movies, they would tell a story, and then they'd type the end, and I would type the end. So I suppose it started there, but I didn't have the grammar skills. I didn't know really how to write, but it was always there.
And you learn to write by writing, don't you?
You do,
yeah.
And yes.
Were your earliest examples fiction or nonfiction?
Well, when I first started, when I was first published, I did write a couple of pieces of fiction. Mm. Yes.
Now or Never is the dual biography of two men, George Stevens and James Henry Gooding.
Right.
These men came alive for me as a reader through their own eloquent words. How did you hit upon this idea And how difficult was it to find the various writings of Mr. Stevens and Mr. Gooding?
Okay. Public art has influenced me a lot. And for those of you who have the fortune of visiting Boston, in front of the State House in the Commons is this wonderful piece of public art, the Shaw Memorial.
Yeah.
And it's dedicated to the men of the 54th. And when I was working in Boston, I would pass it twice a day, going and coming. And I promised myself one day I would write a story about not necessarily Shaw, but the men, the troops. And again, coming from Nebraska or from Missouri, seeing blacks in a sculpture positively portrayed was very eye-opening for me, and it made me want to be able to tell their story. And so I started doing, after retiring, I started doing research on the 54th. And it so happens that I found 2 academic books that had transcribed the letters of James Gooding and George Stevens. They were, in addition to being soldiers, they were also war correspondents. The first black war correspondents in history, in our history anyway. James Gooding wrote for an abolitionist newspaper based in New Bedford, and George Stevens wrote for a black newspaper out of New York. And so they tell the story. So I had access to 100 of their letters, and it helped me capture what they were going through, how they felt about it. And their feelings were different. Gooding's feelings are definitely different from Stevens. And at the same time, I had access to Shaw's letters to his family. So,
I would recommend Now or Never to adults as well.
thank you.
I've read quite a bit of history of the Civil War, and on almost every page, I was learning things in your book that I didn't know.
Right.
Yeah. I was rather in awe as I read Now or Never, so full of historical information that was new to me, yet presented in such a smooth, flowing manner. Easier said than done. How do you do that?
Well, that trick of writing, as you know, Mick,
Yeah.
is keeping your butt in the chair long enough and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting till you get it right. And also, for those of you who are aspiring to be writers, it's important to read your work aloud so that you hear how it sounds and you pick up a certain kind of rhythm that you want to continue. And you keep in mind, as I'm writing in this particular book, for young adults, 12 and up, I want to make sure, I want to have all the historical facts as accurate, I want to have them accurately as possible. But at the same time, I don't want to bore the reader. I want to keep the reader engaged in the story.
I was engaged.
So it's a combination of knowing your history, knowing your facts, and telling them in an engaging way.
I taught for 38 years, and my students would get tired of me saying, read your writing out loud. You can put me out of business if you do that. You wouldn't need me.
Right.
Do you read the rough draft out loud as you're writing it, or do you do it in the revision stage?
All the time. I do it all the time.
All the time.
In all stages.
Okay. Hence the smoothness of your writing.
Right.
As a man who resembles a snowman on the beach, I have never, ever experienced the evil of bigotry. Not once. However, I was raised by my family to believe that bigotry is a poison and a sin. As a writer and scholar who aims to show young people the truth of our nation's past, how do you view this recent movement in several states to eradicate the teaching of the truth of our national past, as if slavery, Jim Crow, and Emmett Till never existed?
Well, it's a tough question. In fact, I was writing something in the last couple of days, and I start off by saying, anytime we want to have a conversation about race, it makes many people, black or white, uncomfortable. But I think my perspective is, how do you tell the story of American progress. And for those who want to deny or limit, restrict content in American history, what they're doing is denying the progress this country has made.
Yes.
In my next book, I start with a slave within the president's house, and George Washington's president, and move up to Obama going into the White House. Mm-hmm. If that isn't progress, regardless of your political perspective, it isn't. It is progress.
Yes.
And if you think in terms of, and I think in terms of my own life, as I said, even though it may sound strange, my grandfather was enslaved for his first 6 years. I was fortunate enough to have an education, to attend Harvard, to become a senior executive at a major corporation, and now I'm sitting here with you.
Yep.
I like to think of all that as progress, and I think it's progress that I've been able to give to my children, and they are giving to their grandchildren. Now, that's not to say there aren't challenges ahead of us, mm-hmm. but nevertheless, we cannot and should not want to deny the progress the country has made.
No, of course not. And of course, the word that we hear over and over again from kindergarten on is freedom, freedom, freedom. Mm-hmm. Well, the freedom to read books, mm-hmm. and the freedom to teach the truth of our nation's past.
Right.
It seems turning away from that is betraying the very meaning of the word freedom.
And oftentimes, people will use the phrases freedom, liberty, justice to mean just the opposite, yep. to carry out just the opposite. Yep. If you think of you think of January 6th and the number of people talking about freedom, and yet at the same time, it's hard not to see that as an insurrection.
Yep, you're speaking the truth. Here's a sentence that mm-hmm. might sound familiar. Stevens inhaled the odor of stale sweat ripened in southern humidity. The smell of fear and despair still clung to the walls. That is brutal, raw poetry. What is your writing process?
Well, it's a combination of, as I said, the historical facts, and then trying to find a way to tell the story to a 12-year-old. Mm. At the same time, I'm a big believer that writers need to do site visits. Mm. So I was actually in the prison in Charleston, the slave trading post, where some of the soldiers of the 54th who were captured after one of the battles were taken. And so it still exists in Charleston. I was there. So you could, by physically visiting it, it was easier for me to imagine what it was like for those who were incarcerated there, mm-hmm. and to find a way to tell that story so that you want your reader to feel, to see, and even to smell, what you're describing.
Yeah. On these visits, do you take notes while you're there?
No. Mm. It's all sort of camera in my mind, if you like.
Drinking it all in.
Yes, just not too much drinking.
Of course.
Okay. Yes.
You dedicate Now or Never to, I'm quoting, mm-hmm. Kathleen, for
right.
her daily encouragement and patience. I assume this is your wife?
It is. My wife, who would have driven down with me today, but had another event to be at. But when you write, it can be lonely. Mm-hmm. For me, it's filled with self-doubt, and your spouse can be especially in my case, can be your biggest cheerleader. Mm-hmm. And someone you can go and say, oh, isn't this great? Or doesn't this suck?
Yeah.
Right.
Because we know our wives are very honest, aren't
they? Yes, they are.
Now, I had never heard of Ona Judge, and now I'll never, ever forget her. You and artist Keith Mallett have created, I feel, a work of art that vividly shows the emotional cruelty of slavery. Not just the physical, but the emotional cruelty.
Right.
What was the initial spark for this amazing book?
Well, my youngest daughter was a graduate student at University of Pennsylvania, and when I was down there visiting, she's a history major, we went to Independence Hall and to see the Liberty Bell, and we also went to the physical site where the president's house was located. Had just been dedicated, reopened for as a site visit place now. And there was the story of Ona Judge, a story that I was unfamiliar with. And I was struck, and I chose that I wanted to tell that story. And in this book, I tell it for young children. And in my next book, I tell it for older children. But in this particular book, what I wanted to do, I take a day of her life. She's 23 years old. She's been enslaved for 23 years. And imagine, and I wanted to show a different side of slavery that isn't taught in schools. And that is, imagine you're a field hand and you're working 12 hours a day, and there's this very attractive young lady who has the best job a slave can have. And one day you hear, she ran away? Yeah. Why'd you run, Ona Judge? And so that led me into the story.
Beautiful. Right. I highly recommend both those books to our viewers.
Thank you.
You once said that the first question you ask yourself is, why should a reader care about this subject?
Right.
Well, why should a reader care about Ona Judge, George Stevens, and James Henry Gooding?
Well, I think that's the goal of writing for the writer. You have to keep in mind, and you have to ask yourself, how are you going to make the reader care? How are you going to create character, story, structure the story in such a way, present conflict, so in order for the reader to care? Why? I mean, young readers today have so many options. The last option they think of usually is a book, as opposed to a video game or hanging with friends or podcasts.
Yep.
The whole idea of sitting down with a book, especially sitting down with a book outside of school, is rare. So you're obligated to engage them in a way, give them a reason to read.
You know, I'm an old dude reading it. What I was knocked out by, the unquenchable spirit of all three, the times in which they lived, the obstacles that faced them, greater than any obstacle that I've ever encountered naturally. They just stood up to those obstacles, unquenchable spirit.
And of course, that's what the people we come to admire, regardless of ethnicity or gender, have those characteristics because they inspire us. They're part of our aspirations to be more, to belong to something bigger, larger. And what they do is heroes improve us.
Yep. Duke Ellington said, there are two rules to life. Rule number one, never, ever, ever give up. Rule number two, never forget rule number one.
Yes.
I love it.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Let's talk about your career at Houghton Mifflin. I was an editorial assistant at Little Brown in 1982-83, and we played softball against you guys, and I hate to say it, Ray, but we beat you.
Yeah. How I ended up with Houghton is I was a teacher. I grew up, as I said, I grew up in Nebraska, graduated from the University of Nebraska, moved to Iowa. That was my idea, moving east. I moved. I taught in Iowa for a couple years, and then I had a chance to attend the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I moved to Boston, and I decided that because of my interest in writing and my classroom experience and my educational background, I wanted to go into educational publishing. And so I left. When I graduated from Harvard, I went into educational publishing. I spent some 13 years at Scholastic in New York, and then I was hired by Houghton Mifflin, and eventually became a corporate VP and editor-in-chief of the school publishing.
So did you live in New York when you worked for the earlier publisher?
Oh, yes.
And then moving to Boston?
Yes. Yeah.
Has your teaching career at both Phillips Andover and Brandeis had an impact on your writing career or on how you frame your work?
Well, teaching just reminds you, particularly teaching at the secondary level, whether it's middle school or high school, reminds you of the importance of engaging your audience. And I think also that my experience of teaching at the college level was about the importance of doing your research and knowing your facts and being able to tell an honest story. So that's the influence.
I'm very hopeful for the future because I've met the young people of today and the way they question things, their hope for the future. I think there's good things up ahead with these young people.
Yes.
In fall of 2023, we can look forward to a young adult verse biography, A Long Time Coming, the Ona Judge to Barack Obama Chronicles. Please tell us about this new Ray Anthony Shepard book.
Well, thank you for asking, because this is a book that I'm really proud of. It's something I've worked on for the last 4 years. It's coming out, as you said, next fall. It's my attempt to tell a full story of the what I talk about, the American progress. That how do you go from a slave in the president's house to a black president in the White House? Or how do you go from the first white president to the last black president? And I wanted to tell the story in a way, again, to engage kids, so I've decided to tell it in verse. Sometimes and I don't want to confuse. I don't want you to confuse poetry and verse. My wife sometimes calls it, I'm writing in senior citizen rap, but it's an attempt to tell a story in sharp phrases. So let me see if I can give you recite an example, if I may. The book starts out with this question: have you ever wondered why there were the unfreed in the land of the free?
That grabbed you.
Yeah, it's a way to begin to capture the student's interest.
And the way in Ona Judge, why did you run? Why did you run? Having the reader thinking of these questions while he or she is reading.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh.
And yes.
You were telling me about a research trip you and your wife took to various places for this new book. Could you tell us about that?
Well, we could. While I was writing the book, we couldn't travel because of the pandemic. But as soon as the pandemic lessened, we went to we flew to Atlanta, Georgia, and then began at the Martin Luther King birth house in Atlanta, attended Ebenezer Baptist Church for a Sunday morning service. We then drove to Birmingham, the site of the Birmingham bombings and the dogs and water hoses. We drove to Montgomery, the site of the Montgomery March, and we walked the Pettus Bridge from Selma, and then drove to Mississippi, to Ida B. Wells Museum, and then to Memphis, Tennessee, and we ended, as I said, we started with where Martin Luther King was born, and we ended at room 306 at the Lorraine Motel, the room where he spent his last night before the assassination.
So you can walk right into the rooms?
Well, it's glassed off,
Yeah.
but it's opened, and it's set up just as he left it.
Yeah. And that shocking photograph of Dr. King on the
on the
balcony out
right.
there, and wow.
And all of these stories that I have, whether it's Ona Judge, in terms of you have the best job a slave could have, why is that enough, to King, to Obama. Again, I'm repeating myself. It tells the story of progress. And I wanted to site visit to make sure I had my descriptions right.
Yep.
So that part was very important.
And with progress comes hope.
Yes.
With progress comes hope.
And so those the Moms of Liberty, organizations that are trying to censor books, you can't help but ask, why is it that they want to hide the American progress?
Right.
I still don't have an answer for that.
Yep. I think I'm going to end with this. You are a prestigious award winner. You have won the Jane Addams Children's Book Award for 2022. How did you find out that you had won this award?
Well, it came as a surprise. First of all, my publisher called me and said I was shortlisted, and I quickly looked at the books that were listed, and I said, "Well, it's nice to be shortlisted."
Yeah.
And then I was selected as an honor book, which surprised me, and it was very gratifying.
Congratulations, sir. And great luck with your books up ahead. I hope you come back next autumn when your latest is released.
Please, I'd love to. Please invite me.
All right, Mr. Shepard.
Thank you very much.
What an honor. What an honor.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And this has been Books and the World. I highly recommend the books of Mr. Shepard. Thank you very much.